Wind hissed through the sagebrush, a dry, scraping sound like a warning whisper across the Arizona territory. Inside the one-room cabin, the only movement was the woman. She didn't look at Silas Thorne, perched on a stool near the cold hearth, whittling a useless piece of pine. Her focus was absolute, bent double, scrubbing the packed earth floor near the door. Her knuckles, raw and red, worked the stiff bristles of the brush against a stubborn, dark stain. Old blood, Silas knew, from the buck he dressed carelessly weeks ago. Her silence wasn't just quiet. It was a palpable thing, thick as the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of late afternoon light piercing the lone window. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something extra special saved just for you. This was Maeve Connolly, the woman he paid 50 cents a week to clean, and her silence scraped at him almost as much as the brush scraped the floor. Silas Thorne, at 36, carried solitude like a second skin. The cabin, nestled in a fold of Ochre Hills miles from the nearest speck of a settlement, Whisper Creek, was his refuge and his cage. He'd built it years ago, dreaming of a future that vanished like desert rain when fever took Eleanor. Trapping, then a stint in the played-out silver mines near Tombstone, left him with callous hands, a few scars, and a deep-seated wariness of everything, especially connections. Yet, 2 weeks ago, driven by a sudden, almost violent disgust of the squalor he let accumulate, he'd ridden into Whisper Creek. At the mercantile, old man Henderson, chewing tobacco with slow deliberation, had mentioned Maeve. Does for folks. Quiet sort. Needs a work. That was all. Silas hired her on the spot. He watched her now, covertly, over the curve of the pine block in his hands. She was maybe 25, but life had etched lines around her eyes that belonged on someone older. Her dress, faded calico the color of dust, was worn thin at the elbows and neatly patched at the hem. A frayed shawl, despite the cabin's warmth, stayed knotted tightly around her thin shoulders. Her hair, the color of burnt sienna, was pulled back severely beneath a simple bonnet, escaping in wisps that clung damply to her temples. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of bone-deep fatigue, yet her cleaning was thorough, almost fierce. She attacked the greasy residue on the cast-iron stove, hauled buckets of water from the well outside without complaint, beat his threadbare blankets with a vigor that sent clouds of dust swirling in sunbeams. Not a word passed her lips beyond a murmured morning, Mr. Thorne, when she arrived, and a soft done when she finished. Today, she'd found a bloodstain. Silas felt a prickle of shame, watching her labor over his mess. He'd offered extra pay last week, noticing the thinness of her wrists, the way her boots were splitting at the seams. He'd held out an extra quarter. For the trouble, he'd gruffed. She looked at the coin, then directly at him for the first time. Her eyes, a startlingly clear gray, held no reproach, only a deep, guarded weariness. "No need, Mr. Thorne," she'd said, her voice low and husky, like stones shifting in a dry creek bed. She'd turned back to sweeping before he could argue. The refusal stung, a rebuke to his clumsy attempt at kindness. Why refuse coin? Pride? Fear? Something else? The rhythmic scraping stopped. Maeve sat back on her heels, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a faint smudge of dirt. She surveyed the clean patch of floor, then gathered her brush and pail. The sun was dipping low, painting the cabin walls in long orange stripes. Time for her to leave. Silas felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the prelude to another empty evening. He stood abruptly, the stool scraping loud on the floorboards. Maeve flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible recoil that made Silas freeze. He hadn't meant to startle her. "Here," he said, his voice rougher than intended. He fished in his pocket, pulling out the 50-cent piece. He held it out. She didn't meet his eyes this time, just took the coin with fingers that trembled slightly. Her hand was ice cold, even in the warm cabin. She tucked the coin deep into a hidden pocket of her skirt, "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." Her voice was barely a whisper. She moved toward the door, picking up a worn cloth bundle, her things, he presumed. Nothing more than a few rags. She paused at the threshold, silhouetted against the dying light. For a fleeting second, she seemed to hesitate, her shoulders tense. Then, without a backward glance, she stepped out into the deepening twilight. Silas stood rooted. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. It pressed on him, suffocating. He thought her cold hand, the flinch, the refusal of extra coin, the weariness etched into her young face like scars. Where did she go? Back to Whisper Creek? He'd never seen her there except that first hiring. A strange, restless energy seized him. The loneliness, usually a familiar ache, suddenly felt sharp, unbearable. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a pull, a need to know the source of that profound silence, that guarded exhaustion. He acted without conscious thought, grabbing his worn leather jacket and his Winchester, leaning by the door. Habit, not expectation, trouble. He slipped out. The air outside was cool, smelling of dust and sage. The sky was bleeding crimson in the west, indigo swallowing the east. May was already a small, dark figure moving steadily away from the cabin, not toward the wagon track leading to Whisper Creek, but angling southeast toward the steeper, more rugged folds of the hills where the pinyon pines grew thick. Silas followed. He kept his distance, using the gathering dusk and the sparse-covered juniper and boulders. His boots crunched softly on the gravelly soil. He felt a fool, skulking after a cleaning woman. But the image of her raw knuckles, the stubborn set of her shoulders as she refused his coin, propelled him forward. She moved with surprising speed and certainty, navigating a path invisible to him, winding through arroyos and scrambling over low ridges where the earth was the color of rust. The land grew wilder, the shadows deeper. The only sounds were the crunch of his own steps, the distant cry of a coyote and the soft sigh of the wind. He lost sight of her for a moment as she rounded a large outcrop of weathered sandstone. Hurrying, heart thudding oddly against his ribs, he reached the rock and peered cautiously around its edge. The breath left his body. Below him, nestled in a shallow depression shielded by overhanging rock and dense, thorny chaparral, wasn't a cabin. It wasn't even a shack. It was a shelter cobbled together from desperation. Canvas tarps, patched and faded, were stretched taut over a framework of crooked pine branches, lashed together with twine. One side was braced against the sandstone wall itself, forming a crude lean-to. A thin tendril of smoke struggled upwards from a small, carefully contained fire pit near the entrance, barely visible against the twilight. And there she was, Maeve. She'd set down her bundle and was kneeling now. Not alone. Silas's eyes adjusted to the gloom beneath the tarps. Movement. Small figures. 1, 2, 5. Children, huddled near the feeble fire. The oldest looked no more than 11 or 12. A boy with Maeve's russet hair, handing her a dented tin cup. A girl, perhaps 8, wrapped in a blanket far too large, stirred a small pot suspended over the flames. 2 smaller children, maybe 4 and 6, sat close together on a scrap of worn blanket, their eyes large and watchful in thin faces. And in Maeve's arms, wrapped in a faded shawl, was an infant, its tiny fist waving weakly in the cool air. Maeve took the cup from the boy, her posture softening as she looked down at the bundle in her arms. She murmured something, too low for Silas to catch, but the sound carried a tenderness he hadn't imagined possible from her. She lifted the cup to the infant's lips, her movements gentle, infinitely careful. The older girl leaned against her mother's side, resting her head on Maeve's shoulder. The firelight flickered, catching the sharp angles of their faces, the hollows under their eyes, the frayed edges of their meager clothing. It wasn't just poverty. It was a raw edge of survival. Silas stood frozen on the ridge, the Winchester forgotten in his slack hand. The vast emptiness of the Arizona night pressed down, but it was nothing compared to the crushing weight of the scene below. 5 children, living like rabbits in a hole, and Maeve, Her silence now explained, her weariness a monument to relentless struggle. The 50-cent piece he paid her felt suddenly obscene, worthless. The cliffside crumbled slightly under his boot. A small cascade of pebbles skittered down the slope towards the makeshift camp. The boy's head snapped up. His eyes, wide and alert, scanned the ridgeline. They locked directly onto Silas's shadowed form. The boy didn't cry out. He didn't move. He just stared, his young face hardening into an expression of fierce, protected defiance that belonged on a man twice his age. Silas saw the recognition dawn in those eyes, saw the boy's hand tighten instinctively around a piece of firewood. Maeve followed her son's gaze. Slowly, she lifted her head. The tender light in her eyes vanished, replaced by a flash of pure, unadulterated terror. She clutched the infant tighter, pulling the older girl behind her, her body becoming a shield between the children and the stranger on the ridge. The silence now wasn't just absence of sound. It was a hell breath, a coiled spring, thick with a sudden, chilling understanding that their fragile sanctuary had been breached. The silence shattered. Maeve's terror, raw and immediate, hit Silas like a physical blow. The boy's defiant glare, the infant's thin cry muffled against Maeve's shawl, the way the older girl pressed closer, it rooted him to the crumbling ridge for one agonizing heartbeat. Then instinct, honed by years of solitude and the memory of Eleanor's pleading eyes, kicked in. Run. He stumbled backward, boots skidding on loose scree, turning his back on the tableau of desperate survival below. He didn't look again. The image was seared into him. The flimsy canvas walls, the gaunt faces lit by the guttering fire, the crushing weight of responsibility in Maeve's posture as she shielded them from him. He plunged into the deepening twilight, retracing his path with clumsy haste, the Winchester forgotten weight in his hand. Pinyon branches clawed at his jacket. Unseen rocks twisted his ankles. Every crunch of gravel underfoot echoed like a gunshot in his own ears. He'd violated their fragile sanctuary, driven by a lonely man's intrusive curiosity. Shame, thick and acrid as can smoke, choked him. His comfortable cabin, his full larder, the 50-cent coin, it all felt obscenely privileged against the memory of those 5 hungry faces huddled in the dirt. Eleanor's ghost seemed to whisper from the shadows, not in accusation, but in sorrow. Is this what I left you to? Watching, not living? Back inside his own 4 walls, the familiar emptiness yawned wider, colder. The lingering scent of lye soap from Maeve's cleaning felt like a reproach. He paced the scoured floorboard she'd worked so hard on, the silence amplifying the drumbeat of his guilt. He couldn't unsee it. The boy's fierce eyes, the infant's fragile fist, Maeve's bone-deep exhaustion masked only by terror. He stopped by the rough-hewn cupboard, pulling open the door, half a sack of flour, a side of salted pork wrapped in muslin, 2 thick wool blankets, barely used. Staring at these simple provisions, a plan formed, fragile as spider silk. He wouldn't intrude again, but he couldn't do nothing. Hours later, under a sky thick with icy stars, Silas moved like a ghost through the scrubland. The moon, a sliver of bone, cast long, deceptive shadows. He carried a burlap sack, flour, salt pork, a small jar of molasses purloined from his own sparse treats, and one of the thick blankets rolled tight. Approaching the sandstone outcrop overlooking the lean-to, he moved with exaggerated care, avoiding the loose scree that had betrayed him before. Below, the campfire was reduced to embers, a dull red eye in the blackness. No movement, only the soft, rhythmic sound of sleep or exhaustion drifted faintly on the cold air. He couldn't see them, but he felt their presence, a vulnerable knot of life in the vast, indifferent night. He edged down the slope, silent as the night hawk circling high above. 10 yards from a canvas flap serving as a door, he stopped. Close enough. He placed the sack carefully on a flat rock, ensuring it was visible in the first light of dawn. He hesitated, then added the small wooden rabbit he'd whittled weeks ago, a pointless thing suddenly imbued with meaning. A gesture, an apology. He retreated back up the ridge, melting into the juniper shadows, watching until the cold seeped into his bones. Just before dawn's gray fingers touched the eastern hills, the canvas flap stirred. Maeve emerged, shawl pulled tight, scanning the ridge line with hunted eyes. She saw the sack instantly. Her hand flew to her mouth. She stood frozen for a long minute, tension radiating from her slight frame. Then, with a swift, furtive movement, she darted forward, grabbed the sack, and vanished back inside the lean-to. She hadn't looked towards his hiding place, but she hadn't left it either. 3 days passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Silas avoided the ridge, the weight of his secret action a constant hum beneath his thoughts. He chopped with unnecessary violence, the rhythmic thud a poor substitute for peace. When Maeve arrived for her scheduled cleaning, the air crackled with unspoken tension. She was paler than usual, shadows like bruises beneath her eyes. She didn't speak, didn't meet his gaze, moving with her usual silent efficiency. But Silas noticed small things. Her calico dress, though still worn, seemed cleaner. The frayed edges of her shawl had been meticulously mended with tiny, neat stitches. When she bent to scrub the hearth, her sleeve rolled up slightly, revealing a thin, white scar tracing the delicate bone of her wrist, old but precise, like the mark of a blade. Silas's stomach clenched. He remembered the boy's fierce defiance, the protective way he gripped the firewood. What had they fled? He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud. "Cold snap comin'," he offered gruffly, gesturing vaguely toward the window where gray clouds massed. Maeve flinched, a tiny recoil, her shoulders tightening. She didn't look up, just scrub harder at a non-existent spot on the stone. Wind's got a bite to it. Silence. Only the rasp of the brush. The rebuff stung, but he understood. Trust was a currency scarcer than gold out here. He busied himself mending a harness, watching her from beneath his hat brim. As she gathered her things to leave, she paused. Not at the door, but near the stool he often sat on. From her small cloth bundle, she withdrew a smooth river stone, striped with bands of ochre and slate gray. She placed it carefully on the stool, her eyes darting to his face for a fleeting second, a look devoid of warmth, but perhaps, just perhaps, less filled with terror. A silent acknowledgement? A payment? Then she was gone, vanishing into the afternoon's gathering gloom. The stone felt warm in Silas's palm, worn smooth by ancient water. A fragile thread, thinner than spider silk. But there, he pocketed it, a strange lump forming in his throat. The next day, driven by a restlessness he couldn't name and a need for coffee beans, he rode into Whisper Creek. The settlement felt claustrophobic after the vast silence of the hills, a single rutted street lined with false-fronted buildings, the ever-present dust hanging in the air, smelling of horses, manure, and cheap whiskey from the saloon. He tied his horse at the hitching rail outside Henderson's mercantile, the bell jangling harshly as he entered. The familiar smells of dried beans, leather, and coal oil greeted him. Old man Henderson, perched on a stool behind the counter, nodded. "Thorne, coffee's in." He gestured toward the burlap sacks. Silas grunted. Picking up a scoop, he was reaching for a small sack when the door opened again, bringing a gust of cold wind and a stranger. The man was tall, lean but hard-looking, dressed in trail-dusted clothes that had seen better days. A worn coat revolver hung low on his hip. His face was weathered, bisected by a thin, puckered scar running from temple to jawline, pulling one corner of his mouth into a permanent sneer. His eyes, pale and restless, scanned the dim store, lingering on Silas for a moment before dismissing him. He leaned an elbow on the counter, too close to Henderson. "Howdy," the stranger drawled, his voice raspy. "Looking for some information. Paying for it." He flipped a silver dollar onto the counter. It spun, glinting dully. Henderson eyed the coin, then the stranger, his expression guarded. "Depends on the information, mister." The stranger's pale eyes swept the store again, as if checking for eavesdroppers. He leaned in slightly. "Looking for a woman. Young. Brown hair. Traveling with a passel of kids." 5 of them. Heard tell she might have passed through these parts. Maybe working for folks. His gaze sharpened, pinning Henderson. Cleaning, maybe? Silas froze, the coffee scoop hovering over the sack. The air in the store seemed to thicken, the scent of dust suddenly cloying. He kept his face impassive, eyes fixed on the coffee beans, but every nerve screamed. Maeve. He forced his hand steady, pouring the beans into his sack. Henderson scratched his stubbled chin, slow and deliberate. Lots of folks pass through, mister. Henderson said carefully. Lots of women work hard. Cleaning, washing. Kids ain't uncommon. He nudged the silver dollar back, slightly with a gnarled finger. Don't recall any one specific match in that just now. Sorry. The stranger's scarred face tightened. He didn't touch the coin. Think harder, he said, the rasp in his voice turning dangerous. Man could find himself grateful. Real grateful. He pushed the coin back toward Henderson. Keep it. For your trouble. You remember anything specific. You know where to find me. Ask for Harlan. He turned, his pale eyes sweeping over Silas once more, a flicker of assessment. Then he was gone, the door banging shut behind him. The silence he left was heavy, charged. Silas finished tying his coffee sack, his fingers cold and clumsy. He paid Henderson, avoiding the old man suddenly knowing, worried look, stepping back out into the dusty street. Silas scanned the boardwalks. Harlan was nowhere to be seen. But the name, the scar, the cold thread in his voice, it hung in the air like gunsmoke. Silas mounted his horse, the river stone a heavy weight in his pocket. He nudged the horse not towards home, but towards the rugged hills sheltering the lean-to. He needed to see, to warn something. The trail seemed longer, the afternoon light harsher. He dismounted a quarter-mile from the sandstone outcrop, tethering his horse in a thicket of juniper. Moving with practiced silence, he approached on foot, circling wide to come to sheltered depression from above. He reached a familiar vantage point, the wind sighing through the chaparral. Below, the lean-to looked achingly vulnerable. The fire was unlit. No movement. Then, near the base of the slope leading down to camp, partially hidden by a clump of rabbit brush, something caught his eye, something small and out of place. He crept closer. It was a crude wooden horse, whittled from pine, one leg snapped off. He recognized it, a toy he'd seen clutched in the hands of a 6-year-old boy days ago. Beside it, clear in the soft earth, was a single boot print, large, deeply impressed, not his own worn, familiar tread. And beside the print, ground into the dirt, lay the crushed, damp stub of a hand-rolled cigarette. The tobacco smelled cheap, acrid, unmistakable, fresh. Silas's blood ran cold. Harlan hadn't just asked questions in town. He'd come hunting. He'd been here, watching, waiting. Silas scanned the silent lean-to, the surrounding rocks suddenly seeming to hold 1,000 hidden threats. The fragile thread of trust, the small stone in his pocket, felt meaningless against the cold reality of the cigarette stub and that lone, menacing boot print pressed into the earth beside a broken child's toy. The hunter had found the den. The crushed cigarette stub lay like a venomous insect beside the broken wooden horse. Silas Thorne crouched, the acrid smell of cheap tobacco burning his nostrils, a counterpoint to the cold dread solidifying in his gut. Harlan hadn't just watched, he'd trespassed, stolen the flower, a deliberate act of cruelty, a predator marking territory. Silas's fingers brushed the snapped leg of the pine horse, a child's simple world shattered. He scanned the silent lean-to, the surrounding rocks suddenly bristling with imagined threats. Every shadow held Harlan's pale, scarred gaze. He retreated like a hunted thing himself, circling back to his horse with senses screaming. The ride home was a blur of ochre hills and gray sky, the wind carrying whispers of violence. Back in his cabin, the familiar walls felt flimsy, inadequate. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the hush before the storm. Eleanor's memory surfaced, not the gentle ghost, but the fevered woman clinging to his hand, whispering, "Promise me, Silas. Promise you won't fade away." He hadn't faded. He'd fossilized. Until now, action was the only antidote to the gnawing fear. He checked his Winchester methodically, the oil metal cool and reassuring under his calloused fingers. He dragged his heavy work table to barricade the cabin door at night. He filled extra canteens, checked his powder horn, laid out bandages and the small bottle of carbolic he kept for emergencies. Solitude was a luxury he could no longer afford. Responsibility, a heavy, unfamiliar cloak, settled on his shoulders. 5 faces haunted him. Maeve's terror, the boy's defiance. 2 days later, Maeve arrived for cleaning. The tension crackled the moment she stepped inside. She looked gaunt, shadows deeper beneath her eyes, her movements tighter, more guarded. The frayed shawl seemed to swallow her whole. She avoided looking directly at Silas, focusing fiercely on scrubbing the already clean table. Silas noticed the raw knuckles on her right hand, scraped as if she'd fallen or struggled. He busied himself mending a saddle strap near the hearth, the rhythmic pull of the needle a flimsy shield against the question screaming in his head. "Cold set in and fierce," he ventured, his voice rough. "Heard tell snow might come early to the high country." He watched her shoulders tense almost imperceptibly. She didn't respond, just scrub harder. He cleared his throat. "That flour hold out?" A stupid question, he knew. He'd seen the empty sack discarded near the lean-to. Maeve froze. Her knuckles whitened on the scrub brush. Slowly, she lifted her head. Her gray eyes met his. Not with terror this time, but with a weary, desperate defiance. "Gone," she whispered, the word like a stone dropped in still water. Took the blanket. Her gaze flickered toward the window, towards the hills hiding her children. "Left? Nothing." The unspoken, but the fear hung heavy in the air. She looked down at her raw knuckles, then quickly hid her hand in the folds of her skirt. A silent confession. Silas felt a surge of impotent rage. Harlan wasn't just hunting, he was tormenting. "The young un?" Silas asked, keeping his voice low, steady. "The one with the toy horse. He all right?" Maeve flinched as if struck. Her eyes darted to his face, searching. "Kieran," she breathed, the name escaping like a sigh. "He saw." She swallowed hard, her throat working. Said the man had a face like split leather. She mimicked the scar with a trembling finger tracing her own jaw. Kieran watched from the rocks. He don't scare easy. There was a fierce pride beneath the fear. Her oldest boy, named Kieran, a person, not just a shadow. Silas nodded, the name anchoring the boy in his mind. Smart lad. Keep him watching. High ground. He hesitated, then reached into his pocket, pulling out the smooth river stone she'd left. He placed it carefully on the edge of the table nearest her. "Signal," he said gruffly. If something ain't right, leave the stone somewhere I'd see it. On the ridge path, near my well." It was a gamble, offering a lifeline she might never use. Maeve stared at the stone, then at Silas. Her expression was unreadable, a storm of fear, exhaustion, and something else, a flicker of wary consideration. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, not acceptance, but acknowledgement. She finished her work in brittle silence, the air thick with unspoken dangers. As she gathered her meager bundle to leave, she paused, not to place a stone, but to speak, her voice barely audible. "He thinks we're his—" The words were choked, like strayed cattle, damaged property. She pulled her shawl tighter, a shudder running through her. Property don't run. Then she was gone, vanishing into the gray afternoon. Property. The word echoed in the empty cabin, cold and brutal. It explained the scar on her wrist, the terror, the relentless flight. Silas paced, the implications settling like lead. Harlan wasn't just a bounty hunter or a creditor. This was personal, possessive, Deadly. The next morning dawned iron gray and bitterly cold. Silas rode out early, not towards Whisper Creek, but on a wide patrol around perimeter's land and the approaches to the lean-to. He scanned the ground for tracks, the brush for disturbed branches, the skyline for movement. He found nothing new, only the pervasive sense of being watched. He dismounted near the sandstone outcrop, overlooking Maeve's camp, hidden in a thicket of juniper. Below, thin smoke curled from the lean-to. He saw movement. Kieran emerged, a small hatchet in hand, heading toward a sparse stand of pinyon pines for kindling. The boy moved with a cautious alertness beyond his years, his head constantly swiveling, scanning the ridges. Good lad. Then Maeve appeared, carrying a bucket toward the small, rocky seep they used for water. She looked exhausted, her steps heavy. As she bent to fill the bucket, a smaller figure darted out after her. The girl, maybe 8 years old, the one who'd stirred the pot. She clutched a worn doll made of knotted rags. She tugged at Maeve's skirt, pointing back toward the lean-to, her small face pinched with worry. Maeve straightened, setting down the bucket, and hurried back inside. Silas watched, a new knot of concern tightening in his chest. Something was wrong. He waited, patient as the rocks. Minutes later, Maeve reappeared, cradling the youngest girl. Elara. He remembered Maeve murmuring the name weeks ago during a rare, unguarded moment rocking the child. The little girl was listless, her face flushed even from this distance, her head lolling against Maeve's shoulder. Maeve's expression was pure, undiluted fear, a different fear than the one Harlan inspired. This was the terror of helplessness against an invisible enemy. Maeve looked up then, not toward the ridge where Silas hid, but toward the trail leading towards his cabin. Her gaze was desperate, searching the empty path. She shifted Elara in her arms, the child whimpering softly, the sound carrying faintly on the cold wind. Maeve's lips moved, forming silent words. A plea? A prayer? Her eyes, wide with maternal panic, scanned the trail again, then dropped to her daughter's fevered face. In that moment, the carefully constructed wall of silence and self-reliance cracked. She needed help, not against Harlan, but against a foe just as relentless. She needed him. The river stone was forgotten. The unspoken plea hung in the frigid air like a tangible thing. Silas knew the signs. Mountain fever. In a child that small, out here, with nothing, it could be a death sentence. The immediate threat had shifted, sharpened, demanding action before Harlan even made his next move. The fragile thread of survival had just frayed to breaking. The sight of Maeve clutching the feverish child, her desperate gaze scouring the empty trail toward his cabin, severed Silas Thorne's last thread of hesitation. Mountain fever. The words echoed with Eleanor's ghostly cough. He'd watched it steal the strong. A child as small stood little chance in a drafty lean-to with stolen blankets. Harlan's shadow momentarily receded before the immediacy of death. He moved, down the slope, crashing through brush, heedless of stealth. Maeve whirled at the sound, clutching Elara tighter, her face a mask of terror that morphed into stunned disbelief as he emerged from the juniper thicket. Kieran materialized beside her, hatchet raised, his young face set in a fierce mimicry of manhood. "Child needs warmth," Silas stated, his voice rough but low, cutting through Maeve's panic. He didn't reach for Elara. That would shatter everything. Cabin's tight. Got a stove. Medicine. He met Maeve's wide, gray eyes. The plea he'd seen moments ago was replaced by a frantic calculation. The known devil of Harlan versus the unknown peril of trusting the solitary man. The immediate threat of her daughter's rattling breath. Elara whimpered, her small body shuddering against Maeve's chest. Maeve's gaze flickered to Kieran, then back to Silas. A lifetime of fear warred with primal need. Finally, a jerky nod. "Lila," she rasped, gesturing to the wide-eyed 8-year-old clutching the rag doll. "Get the others. Quick." Her voice held a tremor, but also command. The quiet sister, Lila, darted inside the lean-to, emerging moments later shepherding the 6-year-old boy and the toddler. Their faces were pinched with cold and confusion. The journey back to Silas's cabin was a tense, silent procession. Maeve carried Alara, her steps quick and anxious. Silas carried the toddler, the small body warm and surprisingly light against his chest, stirring an ache he'd buried years ago. Kieran walked point, scanning the ridges with unnerving vigilance, the hatchet still gripped tight. Lila held the 6-year-old's hand, her large eyes constantly darting between her mother and the unfamiliar man. The cabin, when they reached it, felt suddenly small, charged with the presence of so much vulnerability. Silas barred a heavy door and dragged the table against it. He stoked the stove until the iron glowed cherry red, filling the room with dry, blessed heat. He cleared his own cot, piling blankets. "Here," he gestured. Maeve laid Alara down, tucking the blankets around her with trembling hands. The child's cheeks were flushed crimson, her breathing shallow and rapid. Silas retrieved the carbolic bottle and a small pouch of dried willow bark from his cupboard. He set water to boil. "Cold cloths," he instructed Maeve, handing her a clean rag. "Head, wrists, slow the fire in her blood." Maeve dipped the cloth in the water basin he provided, her movements precise despite the tremor. She bathed Alara's face, her own etched with lines of exhaustion and fear so deep they seemed permanent. While Maeve tended Alara, Silas prepared the willow bark tea, its bitter scent filling the cabin. He glanced at the other children huddled near the stove. Kieran stood sentinel by the single window, peering through a crack in the shutter. Lila had settled the 6-year-old, Finn, and the toddler, Ben, on a pile of hides near the hearth. She smoothed Ben's hair, humming a tuneless, shaky lullaby, her rag doll clutched in her other arm. Her quiet care was a small anchor in the storm. Silas brought the cool tea to Maeve. "Sips, as much as she'll take." Maeve nodded, lifting Alara's head gently, coaxing the bitter liquid between her lips. Alara whimpered but swallowed. Silas crouched beside the cot. "Saw a scar," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on Alara, not Maeve. "On your wrist. Clean cut." He kept his voice neutral, factual. Maeve froze, the cup halfway to Alara's lips. Her knuckles whitened. She didn't look at him. A long moment stretched, filled only by Alara's labored breathing and the crackle of the fire. Then, so softly Silas barely heard, tried to leave. First time. Took Kieran's toy soldier. Said he'd break the boy's fingers next time. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which made it all the more horrifying. "Mark me instead." Said Branded stock stays put. She finished giving Alara the sip, her hand trembling violently now. Property. The word hung in the stifling air, colder than the wind outside. Silas absorbed this, the casual cruelty tightening his jaw. He reached out, not towards Maeve, but to adjust the blanket over Alara's small shoulder. His hand brushed Maeve's arm. She flinched, a violent recoil, then froze, staring at his hand where it touched her. Her gaze traveled up to his face, not with fear this time, but with a bewildered confusion. He saw her notice the old, puckered scar that traced the back of his own hand, a souvenir from a silver mine collapse, a mark of survival, not ownership. Something unreadable flickered in her eyes. She didn't pull away further. A minuscule bridge built on shared scars. Hours bled into the night. Silas took turns with Maeve applying cool cloths, forcing sips of willow bark tea. Lila helped, fetching fresh water, her small face solemn. Kieran remained at his post, a silent sentinel. Finn and Ben eventually slept, curled together like puppies near the stove's warmth. Alara's fever raged, but the rattling in her breath lessened slightly. Exhaustion finally claimed Maeve. She slumped in the chair Silas had placed by the cot, her head resting on the edge of the mattress near Alara's feet, one hand still clutching the damp cloth. She slept fitfully, her brow furrowed even in repose. Silas banked the fire, He checked the door barricade again, the weight of responsibility a tangible cloak. He thought of the lean-to, unprotected. A thought struck him, cold and urgent. He eased open the shutter crack Kieran watched through. Dawn was a gray smear on the horizon. He scanned the familiar ridges. Nothing moved, but something felt off. The quality of the silence? A missing bird call? "Kieran," Silas murmured. The boy turned, eyes alert. "Need you to watch here. Guard your ma. The little ones. Can't leave, Em." He saw the boy's chest swell with the charge. Kieran nodded sharply, gripping his hatchet handle tighter. Silas grabbed his Winchester. "Be back quick." He slipped out into the pre-dawn chill, the cold air shock. He moved swiftly toward the lean-to, a sense of foreboding growing with each step. He crested the ridge overlooking the shelter depression and stopped dead. Desecration. The canvas tarps were slashed to ribbons, hanging in tattered rags. The framework of pine branches was kicked apart. Their meager possessions, the dented tin cups, the small pot, the scraps of blanket not taken before, were scattered and trampled into the dirt. The carefully contained fire pit was a mess of kicked-out ashes, and pinned to the largest remaining fragment of canvas with a rusty knife was a single, yellowed page torn from a Bible. Silas moved closer, his breath frosting in the air. Scrawled across the scripture in heavy, charcoal letters were the words, "Mine. Coming home." The message was clear. Harlan wasn't just watching. He was asserting ownership, demonstrating his reach. And home didn't mean the lean-to. It meant wherever Maeve was. Silas's blood ran cold. He'd brought them all together, made them a single target. He snatched the page down, the cheap paper crumpling in his fist. He scanned the surrounding rocks, the silent hills. Nothing, but the violation was complete. He turned and ran back towards the cabin, the crumpled page of burning brand in his hand. He burst through the door, slamming it shut and rebarricading it. Maeve jolted awake, her hand flying to where a weapon might have been. Kieran spun, hatchet raised. Silas held up the torn Bible page. He didn't need to speak. Maeve's face drained to what little color it had. She understood instantly. A low moan escaped her, part terror, part fury. She looked from the damning page to her sleeping children, then to Silas, her eyes wide with the dawning horror of the trap. Silas thrust the Winchester into her hands. It was an instinct, a sharing of the only defense he had. "Know how?" he asked, his voice tight. Maeve's fingers closed around the cold stock, her knuckles white. She nodded once, a sharp, jerky movement. Her gaze was no longer bewildered. It was focused, deadly. She checked the load with a fumbling but practiced efficiency that spoke of a past she'd never wanted to revisit. She positioned herself beside the shuttered window opposite Kieran, peering through a crack. Silas drew his Colt, the weight familiar, final. The cabin, moments ago a haven, felt like a too-small box. The stove's heat was oppressive. Ilara murmured in her fevered sleep. Lila clutched her doll, her eyes huge and fixed on her mother, holding the rifle. Finn and Ben slept on, oblivious. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the frantic thudding of Silas's own heart. He watched Maeve's profile, the rigid line of her back, the unnatural stillness as she scanned the gray dawn outside. Then Maeve stiffened. Her breath hitched. She didn't speak, didn't move her head, but her finger tightened infinitesimally on the Winchester's trigger. Silas followed her line of sight through the crack in his own shutter. A shadow detached itself from the scrub oak 20 yards from the cabin door. Tall, lean, moving with a predatory confidence. The weak dawn light caught the brutal scar running down the side of Harlan's face, twisting his mouth into that permanent sneer. He stopped, hands resting lightly near his holstered Colt, his pale eyes scanning the cabin's silent facade. A smile, cold and possessive, touched his ruined lips. He took one deliberate step forward, then another, closing the distance to the barred door. His shadow, long and menacing, fell across the cabin wall, reaching toward the children huddled inside. Maeve's knuckles were bone white on the rifle stock. The cabin held its breath. The shadow stretched long and predatory across the cabin wall, a dark finger pointing towards the huddled children. Harlan stood 20 paces from the barred door, a lean silhouette against the gray wash of dawn. His hands rested near the worn grips of his Colt, the posture deceptively casual, radiating a chilling confidence. That permanent sneer, etched by the scar-running temple to jaw, was visible even in the weak light. He took another step, the crunch of gravel under his boot unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence inside. Silas Thorne's finger hovered over the trigger of his Colt. Sweat trickled down his temple despite the cabin's chill. He could feel Maeve's tension radiating from the opposite window, a live wire humming with terror and fury. He saw her knuckles, white as bone, clenched around the Winchester stock, her cheek pressed against the wood as she sighted through the crack. Kieran mirrored her stance near the other window, the hatchet held ready, his young face a mask of fierce concentration. Lila crouched by the cot, a damp cloth forgotten in her hand, her wide eyes fixed on her mother. Finn and Ben slept on, oblivious, nestled in hides near the stove where Alara lay, her breathing shallow and rapid, her small face still flushed with fever. Harlan stopped. His pale, assessing eyes scanned the cabin's shuttered windows, the heavy door. A low chuckle, raspy and devoid of humor, carried on the cold air. "Maeve, darling," he called, his voice carrying easily. "Playtime's over. You've inconvenienced me long enough. Bring the brats out. We're going home." The word home dripped with venomous possession. Silas saw Maeve flinch, her shoulders hunching as it struck. But she didn't waver. The rifle barrel remained steady. Silas knew speaking would break the fragile advantage of silence, but he couldn't let the man think he faced only a terrified woman. "She ain't going with you, Harlan," Silas called out, his voice rough but carrying. "Turn around. Ride out." Harlan's head snapped toward Silas's window. The sneer deepened. "Thorne, is it? The lonely trapper playing house?" He spat into the dirt. "This ain't your affair. That woman, and what's hers belong to me. Bought and paid for." He took another deliberate step closer. "You harboring stolen property. Old man. Opens you up to recompense." Silas's grip tightened on the Colt. "Only property I see is a man thinking he owns flesh and blood. This land's seen enough of that." He remembered Maeve's words. Property don't run. He wouldn't let her be cattle again. Harlan's hand twitched nearer his holster. "Last chance, Maeve," he barked, his voice losing its false calm. "Come out now, or I burn that shack down around you and drag what's left out of the ashes." His gaze flickered towards the stacked firewood beside the cabin. The threat was real. Inside, Alara whimpered, a weak, pitiful sound. Maeve's breath hitched audibly. Her eyes darted from the window to her daughter, torn between the rifle sight and the child's need. Lila, sensing her mother's distress, dipped the cloth back into the cool water and gently pressed it to Alara's forehead, humming a shaky, broken fragment of a lullaby. Silas knew Harlan would act. The man's pride, his warped sense of ownership, wouldn't allow retreat. He saw the subtle shift in Harlan's weight, the telltale tensing of the gunman's draw shoulder. "Maeve, down!" Silas roared, pivoting his own Colt toward the window crack. The twin blasts were almost simultaneous, a deafening concussion inside the small cabin. Silas's shot punched through the shutter-splintering wood, aimed low at Harlan's thigh. At the same instant, Harlan's bullet smashed through the wood near Maeve's head, showering her with splinters. She cried out, more in shock than pain, but held her ground, the Winchester bucking in her hands as she fired blindly through the haze of smoke and debris. Outside, Harlan grunted, stumbling back. Silas's shot had grazed him, a dark stain blooming on his dusty trousers just above the knee. Fury contorted his scarred face. He drew his Colt fully, firing rapidly at the cabin, at the windows, the door, the bullets thudding into the thick logs or whining off into the dawn. "Kieran, back!" Silas yelled, shoving the boy away from the window as another bullet splintered the frame near his head. Smoke stung their eyes. Alara began to cry in earnest, a thin, weak wail of fear and discomfort. Finn and Ben jolted awake, screaming. Lila tried to shield Alara with her own small body, her rag doll fallen to the floor. Harlan, limping but enraged, was moving towards a stacked firewood to make good on his threat. Silas knew he had to stop him before he got close enough to ignite the dry timber against the cabin wall. He risked a glance at Maeve. She was crouched low, reloading the Winchester with trembling but determined hands, her face smudged with soot and blood from a splinter cut on her cheek. Her eyes met his. In that shared, smoke-filled glance, amidst the chaos and the children's cries, passed a torrent of understanding, fear, and fierce resolve. They were in this together. To the end, Silas made a decision. "Cover me," he shouted to Maeve. He didn't wait to see if she understood. He dropped his coat, yanked the heavy table aside from the door, and threw the bar off its brackets. He burst out into the gray dawn, the cold air shock after the acrid smoke. Harlan, halfway to the woodpile, spun, his coat coming up, but May was ready. From the shattered window, the Winchester roared again. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt near Harlan's boots, but it forced him to duck and scramble for cover behind a water trough 10 yards away. Silas charged, not toward Harlan, but towards a man's horse, tethered loosely to a juniper bush nearby. It was a desperate gamble. Harlan, peering over the trough, saw him and snarled, bringing his pistol to bear. Silas dug behind the horse just as Harlan fired. The bullet whined past his ear. The horse, startled, reared and whinnied, pulling against his tether. "Leave him be, Harlan." Maeve's voice rang out, clear and sharp as broken glass, from the cabin doorway. Silas risked a look. She stood framed there, the Winchester steady against her shoulder, aimed squarely at Harlan's cover. Her face was pale, streaked, but utterly resolute. "He ain't yours. None of us are. You hear me? We're done being yours." It was the first full sentence she'd spoken to the man who'd haunted her, a declaration ripped from the depths of her terror. Harlan stared, momentarily stunned by the defiance, by the sight of her holding the rifle like she knew how to use it. It broke his rhythm. In that split second of hesitation, Silas acted. He slashed through the horse's tether with his belt knife. The animal, spooked by the gunfire and sudden freedom, bolted, kicking and snorting, straight towards the scrub. "No!" Harlan roared, lurching out from behind the trough, his focus torn between the escaping horse and Maeve's unwavering rifle. He took a limping step after the horse, then swung back toward the cabin, raising his pistol towards Maeve. Maeve didn't flinch. Her finger tightened on the trigger, but Kieran was faster. The boy darted from the cabin, not with a hatchet, but with a fist-sized rock. He hurled it with all his strength. It struck Harlan squarely on his wounded thigh. Harlan bellowed in pain and surprise, staggering, his shot going wild into the dirt. Silas was moving. He tackled Harlan low, driving his shoulder into the man's injured leg. Harlan went down hard, the pistol flying from his grasp. Silas scrambled for it, kicking it far out of reach into the brush. He pinned Harlan, a knee on his chest, his own knife now at the man's throat. Harlan thrashed, spitting curses, his scarred face contorted with rage and pain. "You're finished here," Silas growled, pressing the blade just enough to draw a bead of blood. "You ride out, now, or the next time that horse stops, it'll be riderless. You understand?" He searched Harlan's pale, hate-filled eyes. "This ain't your home. These people ain't your property. You touch them again, I'll hunt you down like the rabid coyote you are." Harlan glared, panting. He saw Maeve standing firm in the doorway, the rifle still trained on him. He saw Kieran, breathing hard, fists clenched. He saw Silas's cold, certain fury. He saw the vast, empty hills offer no cover, his horse gone. The fight bled out of him, replaced by a venomous calculation. Survival, for now, over pride. He gave a curt, grudging nod. Silas hauled him up, shoved him roughly towards the direction his horse had fled. Go, walk, and keep walking. Harlan stumbled, clutching his bleeding thigh, casting one last, searing look of pure hatred at Maeve before limping into the scrub, following the distant sound of his panicked horse. Silas watched him vanish into the juniper and sage, then turned back to cabin. The adrenaline drained away, leaving him shaking. Maeve lowered the Winchester, her shoulders slumping. Kieran ran to her side. Lila appeared in the doorway, her small face etched with worry. "Ilara, she's cooler, Ma," breathing easier. Her voice was a whisper. Maeve pushed past Silas, dropping the rifle just inside the door, and rushed to the cot. She pressed her hand to Ilara's forehead, then her cheek. A sob escaped her, this time profound relief. The fierce crimson flush was fading, replaced by a more natural, if still pale, color. Ilara's breathing, while weak, was even unlabored. She slept peacefully. Maeve gathered the child into her arms, burying her face in Ilara's hair, her body shuddering with silent tears. Silas stood in the doorway, watching. Finn and Ben clung to Lila's skirts, wide-eyed. Kieran retrieved the fallen rag doll and handed it solemnly to Lila. The cabin was a wreck, smoke-stained, bullet-scarred, smelling of gunpowder and fear. But it was warm, and it held life. Maeve lifted her head, her gray eyes meeting Silas's across the ravaged room. Tears streaked the soot and blood on her face, but her gaze held no fear now. Only exhaustion, relief, and a dawning, fragile wonder. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The shared ordeal, the defiance, the simple miracle of Ilara's cool brow, had forged a bond thicker than blood. Silas walked over to the cold hearth. He picked up the smooth river stone Maeve had left him days ago. It felt warm, solid. He placed it carefully on the mantelpiece, beside the dented tin cup he used every morning. A simple marker, a claim staked not on land, but on something far more fragile and profound. He looked back at Maeve, still cradling Ilara, surrounded by her children. Kieran standing guard, Lila holding the doll, Finn and Ben watching with curious, unafraid eyes. The vast emptiness that had filled his cabin for years was gone, replaced by the quiet chaos of survival, of shared breath, of a future he hadn't dared imagine. "We'll stay," Maeve said softly, her voice raw but clear, her eyes holding his. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a declaration of their own. Silas Thorne, the solitary man, nodded. He walked to the stove and began to rebuild the fire, the first rays of true dawn finally breaking through the cabin's broken shutters, painting the dust motes gold. Outside, the wind sighed through the sagebrush, no longer a warning, but a whisper of the long, hard road ahead, a road they would now walk together.